Dr. Frierson, you're a forensic psychiatrist, correct?
Yes.
What is a forensic psychiatrist?
A forensic psychiatrist is a fully trained psychiatrist who has undergone extra training to learn to deal with issues related to psychiatry and the law, the legal system. It might be cases such as this one where it's a criminal trial and a defendant needs to be evaluated, but I also do a lot of other things. I review records and malpractice cases for the standard of care. I evaluate physicians and nurses and other professionals referred by the medical board or the nursing board when there's a question about their competence to practice. I might evaluate someone to see if they're competent to make a will. There are a whole variety of disability evaluations, a lot of forensic issues.
You had testified outside that the defense called you that you had a music undergraduate degree.
Yes.
Is that correct? What
Yes.
instrument?
Sorry?
What instrument?
Piano.
And I think you graduated with honors. Was that high honors, didn't you?
Yes.
You went to medical school here in South Carolina and graduated with honors from medical school.
Yes.
And then you already testified about your residency and fellowship in forensic psychiatry.
Yes.
Let me ask a few more questions about your background. Currently, since 2012, you were a professor of clinical psychiatry and a vice chair for education, and then in 2017, it became an endowed chair. So what does that mean?
An endowed professorship. It just basically means someone left a lot of money to go towards the university, the School of Medicine, to help offset someone's salary. So Alexander G. Donald was a chair of our department many years ago. He died, and in his estate left some money to endow a professorship.
So what currently do you do at the University of South Carolina?
I am the vice chair for education of the Department of Psychiatry. So my job, first of all and foremost, is to run the Forensic Psychiatry Fellowship. That's a program that trains people to do what I do. So every year I train 2 what we call fellows in forensic psychiatry to become forensic psychiatrists. I also oversee the provision of medical student education, general psychiatry residency training, and child psychiatry and geriatric psychiatry residency training. Although they have their own directors for each one of those programs, I sort of oversee all the educational activities.
I also noticed from your curriculum vitae, your resume, that it says since 2007, you've been a consultant to the South Carolina Department of Corrections at Gilliam Psychiatric Hospital. What is that?
That's the hospital and the Department of Corrections where people with severe mental illness are hospitalized when they need an inpatient, which is the highest level of care. So I treat patients every Tuesday afternoon, probably see 6 or 8 patients, depending if they're new ones, every Tuesday afternoon, and I provide treatment. I prescribe medications for them and talk to them.
You're a clinician too.
Oh yes, and I supervise some residents in our general psychiatry clinic outside of prison in treating patients.
Board certifications. What does that mean?
Board certification means you take a big exam. It's like the bar exam or some exam that's just for your specialty. So it was about a half-day exam. You go to a computer center and sit there, and you have to study, and then you take the exam. And if you pass, you are board certified.
So you are board certified in forensic psychiatry?
Yes.
And have been since 2002, I think. Is that correct?
I think I've been board certified in forensic psychiatry since 1994. I recertified in 2000.
Yes, it says diplomat is what it says.
Yeah, I first passed it, and then you have to pass a test every 10 years to make sure you're still up to date, that you know what you're doing. So I've actually took the initial test in 94 because I was working for the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology invited me to help write questions for the exam. So I did that for many, many years and ended up having to take my research 2 years early. So I took it in 2002. 2002, and then I just took the board certification again like a year or two ago.
What is the American Academy of Psychiatry and the Law?
The American Academy of Psychiatry and the Law is the largest organization of forensic psychiatrists in the country. It's about 2,000 members.
Forensic psychiatry.
All forensic psychiatrists, yes.
Now, in 2016, you received an award from that organization. Is that correct?
Yes.
And that was the Seymour Pollock Award?
Yes.
What is that? What was that for?
It's given for outstanding contributions in education and training in forensic psychiatry.
And then currently, from October of 2018, you actually were elected and you're actually president of that body right now, aren't you?
Yes. I'm president until October.
You published 2 books,
One's in press, but yes.
and I'm counted up maybe 12 different book chapters.
Yes.
You have been qualified in South Carolina courts as an expert in forensic psychiatry over 300 times,
Yes.
and you have done over 3,500 court-ordered competency to stand trial and criminal responsibility examinations. Is that correct?
Yes.
Your Honor, the state would offer Dr. Frierson as an expert in the field of forensic psychiatry.
Thought we did. No objection.
Done it twice now. He's offering your opinion in the field of forensic psychiatry and can offer opinions based upon his training, expertise, experience. Continue on.
Thank you, Your Honor. For a courts exhibit, I have a copy of his curriculum vitae, and that's Courts 95. It's already been marked.
Right, it'll be Mark's courts exhibit.
Yes, sir.
And Courts 94 is actually a copy of his report.
I thought that was already in some other courts exhibit, but it's okay.
Or how do you,
No, if it's, it's fine.
I may have told her wrong.
No, okay, if Joy's got it twice, she'll figure it out. Okay, me too. I think we had those pre-trial hearings, I think it was introduced. It's okay to have it in the courts exhibits twice.
Good. Dr. Frierson, you became involved in this case after the defendant was put forward an insanity defense and the court ordered an examination and it was assigned to you. Is that correct? Sorry, actually, you had done the competency evaluation before.
Right. I first became involved in 2016 when the court sent an order for an evaluation of Mr. Jones's competency to stand trial. Could you understand what's going on in court, work with his attorneys?
How many times have you interviewed Tim Jones?
Twice in 2016 for that evaluation, and then an additional 4 times beginning September of 2018, November of 2018, and twice in March of this year for the insanity or criminal responsibility evaluation.
How many hours have you spent talking to him?
19.
Why so many?
Because this is not an easy case. It's complicated. There's a lot going on. I wouldn't want to.
So you would agree with me that anybody that's offering a diagnosis should spend the time?
I think so, yes. And, you know, you're always reviewing records. They never end. You would think you're done, and then here they send a whole more CDs full of thousands of pages that and so sometimes you interview a person and then you get this other stuff and you say, wait a minute, I've got to see him again and ask him about this because I didn't know about it before.
You said this was the biggest amount of data you've had in any case.
Yes.
Let me show you what's been marked stage 204 for identification and ask you if that is a excerpt of the copy of your report talking about the sources of information that you reviewed in this case.
I'm just making sure it matches what I have. There were 295 sources, so yes. That's an excerpt.
You know, the state would offer 204 in evidence at the time.
Subject to the redactions that the court has suggested, I'll allow it.
Thank you, Your Honor.
You are.
That's 204. So there was a court order asking you, Dr. Frierson, to assess the defendant for criminal responsibility and capacity to conform.
That was the second order, yes.
What is criminal responsibility in big terms?
Criminal responsibility is another word for the insanity defense, or evaluating someone's mental state at the time of the crime. So I was asked to render an opinion as to whether at the time of the crime, Mr. Jones would have been criminally responsible. In South Carolina, we have a definition for that that's based in a statute. And the definition is a person is not responsible if at the time of the act constituting the alleged offense, he or she lacked the capacity to distinguish legal or moral right from legal or moral wrong, or to recognize the particular acts charged, the actual crimes, as legally or morally wrong. If someone is unable to do that, then they are eligible for a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity.
Thank you, Doctor. So what is it, when it talks about a mental disease or defect, what does that mean?
Generally, a mental disease or defect is something that is defined by DSM-5, or they have a recognized mental disorder that the American Psychiatric Association, through its categorization, says this is a legitimate mental illness. Typically, to get to something so severe that it is going to impair knowledge of wrongfulness, either legal or moral, it has to be a severe mental illness.
You said DSM-5. What is the DSM-5?
It's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders.
What psychiatrists and psychologists use to make diagnoses?
Yes. It's developed so that if I say someone has, let's say, obsessive compulsive disorder, another psychiatrist reading my medical records will know what I'm talking about. That it's defined in that, the criteria for the diagnosis are contained in that manual.
When you talk about legal and moral right and wrong, what are you talking about? What are you having to try to determine?
Like, legal, did they know it was a crime against man? Did they know that what they did was wrong, a criminal act? Did they realize it was a crime they were committing?
And the morality part.
Is it's against the law of God. I mean, that somehow it's morally wrong to do this.
Society.
Society, right. Not law enforcement, but that people would find it morally.
Not a value choice. Not a choice that I might make. You would have to weigh that choice against the morality of society.
Yes, yes.
That's what you're looking at. Right?
Yes.
Capacity to conform, what is that?
Capacity to conform is another issue which we're asked to evaluate, because if a person knew right from wrong, legally and morally, but they couldn't conform their conduct to the requirements of the law, then they're eligible for a verdict of guilty but mentally ill. In other words, to say someone lacked the capacity to conform, they couldn't resist from doing it. They were acting under some irresistible impulse, or they had no other choice in their mind.
I think your report, which you have up there with you, and I've made a court's exhibit, it's 40, 52 pages. Does that sound about right?
Yes.
And that documents what your diagnosis is, everything you reviewed, and highlights what you felt was to be important in reaching your conclusions. Is that fair to say?
Correct. I mean, it's certainly, I don't talk about every single thing. I mentioned it in the list of things that I reviewed, but if some of the school records, for example, of the children which I reviewed, I didn't think information needed to be in my report because it wasn't relevant to the issues that I'm looking at. So I tried to put everything in here that I thought was relevant to the issues of criminal responsibility, capacity reform.
So big picture wise, Exhibit 204 that's in the state is a list of everything you looked at.
Yes.
What you wrote in your report is what you felt was important to reaching your conclusion.
Yes. Part of my job as an evaluator is to shuffle through this massive amount of material and say what evidence in this material has relevance to Mr. Jones's mental state at the time of the alleged offense.
So things that you would consider would be maybe observations by people,
Yes.
co-workers, friends, people who came in contact with him.
Certainly.
Those are obviously important. Also, I guess a big part of it is what he tells you during those 19 hours of conversations you've had. Is that correct?
What he tells me is important. What he does is important, or his actions.
Actions speak louder than words.
Yes.
But the words
Sometimes.
except for true is what he told you. Is that fair to say? That's what your decision is based on.
I have to make a decision as to what he's telling me is supported by evidence. So it's a combination of both. I certainly don't believe everything a criminal defendant tells me is true. But unless I have reason to suspect it's not, I initially give them the benefit of the doubt. Then I look at evidence to make sure it corresponds to what they're telling me. And in this case, we also had a tremendous amount of smartphone documentation as far as what he searched, what websites he visited, what he was looking at, and what someone is doing on their phone can be very revealing about their state of mind at the time.
Is this one of the first cases that you've done that has that kind of information?
I've had others, but not to this detail, and I've never had a case where I had to have a special program installed on my computer just so I could learn how to navigate all that information.
But you found that information important and helpful?
Yes, yes.
You'd agree with me that it's pretty much an extension of what he's thinking and doing?
Yes.
At that time?
Yes.
One of the first things that you address in your report is his claim of auditory hallucinations, which for hearing voices, right?
Yeah, he calls them hearing voices.
That's what he started with.
Right.
But during the course, that's what he told the police, that he heard voices.
Right.
Now, there's no evidence that he told anybody, you didn't find any evidence of anything you reviewed, and you got evidence from the state and the defense about him hearing voices or claiming to hearing voices before he got arrested by the police, correct?
Not that I recall.
So after he gets arrested by the police...
I mean, someone said they heard him talking to himself one time and from another room, and I think that doesn't mean he's hearing voices, but it could. Sometimes people with major mental illness talk back to what they're hearing. But other than that, no.
Understand. Once he gets stopped by the police, though, he starts talking about hearing voices. You spent 19 hours with him. Over the course of that, it's my understanding that when you ask him further and further, what do you mean when you say voices, describe it to me, and you go down, that changes.
Yes.
Or you get a better understanding of it. Maybe that's a better way to say it.
Yes, and I think that, like if I asked, are you hearing a voice like I'm talking to you in this room, like someone's in the room talking to you, And he would say no. And I said, well, can you give me an example of the voices that you're talking about and what they say? And he would say, like, he gave me the example that is easy to come to my mind of when he was convinced that Amber was going to leave him, you know, the voices said, oh my God, what are you going to do? How are you going to take care of the children? Where are you going to get help? How are you going to be able to handle all this? You know, these are what most of us would think have anxious thoughts about going through something stressful, like having 5 kids and getting divorced from your wife and having sole custody and caretaking. I mean, that's just what normal anxious people would think. So it became clear to me that what he calls voices are really anxious thoughts that he doesn't like experiencing, that are unpleasant.
That's what he agrees with you, right?
Yes.
In your conversations, that's not your opinion, that's an agreement that
He agreed with me, yes. He at one point in November in the evaluation said, I've only heard a voice sounding like something talking to me outside of my head twice in my life. And very briefly. And the first time was when he was 10 years old. And he says his mother told him, his stepmother, I think her name was Carolyn, that she didn't want him around anymore. And he says, my imaginary friend told me to kill myself.
that's when he was 10 years old.
And that would certainly make someone very anxious to have someone who has custody of you in part. I know he was living with his father, but for your stepmother said, I don't want you around. And the other time was, he says, on the drive back from the convenience store after buying cigarettes the night of the alleged offense, that he heard a voice, which he described as a gremlin voice, which is sort of atypical, but it said kill the kids. But it was very brief and fleeting.
That was coming from outside of his head.
That's what he said, yes.
And it said kill the kids.
Yes.
That was after Natan was dead and after he went to the gas station, bought
Yes.
a carton of cigarettes and came back.
Yes.
The only proof is him telling you that, though, correct? You're accepting that as true for the purposes of your opinion and diagnosis.
I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt. There's a possibility that it's not true, but I was giving him the benefit of the doubt.
You had made a comment earlier when Mr. Young asked you about him not hearing voices anymore. And I think, if I understood you right, you were explaining that an SSI can stop those anxious thoughts, not a voice.
It's a SSRI, but the way we treat anxiety and the way we treat depression pharmacologically with medicines is the same. The first line treatment is a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, or SSRI. There's a bunch of them. I think I mentioned them this morning. Prozac was the first one. Paxil, Zoloft, Celexa, Lexapro. There's just tons of them available, and sometimes people respond to one but not another. But anyway, those are the medicines used to treat depression and anxiety, and I think actually one of them was prescribed for him by a family practitioner when he was undergoing the divorce. And I think that his voices or anxious thoughts likely improved because he was getting one of those medicines.
One of the questions that Mr. Young had asked you had to do with a series of questions, and it said if you have a family history of mental illness, you're more likely to get, for instance, a mental illness or schizophrenia, correct?
Yes.
If you have a history of violence in your house, you may end up with a mental illness. Be careful.
Childhood trauma is one risk factor.
Okay.
But it doesn't, most people with childhood trauma don't necessarily go on to develop mental illness.
Drug use, the same thing.
Yes.
Head trauma, the same thing.
Yes.
But just because you have one or all of those doesn't mean that you will have mental illness, does it?
That's correct.
you still have to go to the criterion of the diagnosis and the DSM-5.
Right, that's what we rely on. We don't rely on other tests or scans or genetics. I mean, it's interesting to know genetic backup. That's why we ask a family history. And it's very clear his mother had schizophrenia and had a severe case of schizophrenia. I mean, she was hospitalized for very long periods of time. She was on medications throughout her life, including medications that are sort of used as a last resort. Like when you fail all these other medicines, we give you one called Clozaril, which she, I believe, is taking now, or at least the last records that I saw. But having a parent with schizophrenia raises your rate. Schizophrenia occurs in 1 in 100 people. So the incidence of schizophrenia is 1%. Having a parent with schizophrenia raises your rate of the likely development to somewhere between, let's say, 10 and at the maximum 15%. Actually, it's like 7 to 15%, depending on what study you read. So to state that differently, if my parent has schizophrenia, there's like a 7 to 10% chance, or 7 to 15% chance that I'll get it. But there's 85 to 93% chance I won't develop schizophrenia.
So as a psychiatrist, it's nice to know.
It's nice to know there's a family history because I'm going to make sure I check this out when I'm interviewing somebody.
Correct. But it doesn't have anything to do with the diagnosis.
Not making the diagnosis, no.
Same with head trauma. It's nice to know.
It's nice to know that this person has had a head injury because they are at increased risk for things, but then you got to go.
You got to go further.
Go further and ask those questions and do some
testing.
Testing, right.
One other thing that Mr. Young had asked you about was hyper-religious. So if I use the term hyper-religiosity or hyper-religious, what does that mean?
That this person, during periods of when they are ill or not stabilized on medication, can have bizarre religious thoughts that are outside of an accepted cultural norm. I have a guy right now at the Department of Corrections who believes he is Allah. And
but when we get to that level of hyper-religiosity, it affects your life. It affects your job.
right, it causes impairment.
Correct.
For example, he's gotten in trouble assaulting people when they don't believe him. He feels disrespected.
And you're looking at Mr. Jones's religious beliefs and backgrounds and practices. You did not find him to be hyper-religious, did you?
No, I mean, not in a mental illness sense, no. He's very religious.
Very conservative.
Very conservative, apostolic, Pentecostal. I know other people that I've met across my life that are apostolic Pentecostals. They speak in tongues. They do a lot of things that has not been in my religious experience, but I wouldn't call that mental illness for any stretch of the imagination.
One of the after in the voices, one of the next things you talk about in your report is his suicide or attempted suicide attempt that Mr. Young was asking you about, correct?
Yes.
So he first said that he heard voices telling him to kill himself. Is that correct?
Yes.
What he reported to the SCDC staff.
Because he had missed a dose of medicine, yes.
After that, a few days later, he had something different to say to SCDC, didn't he?
I was never suicidal. I was just mad.
He was mad over what?
Them not giving him his medicine.
And I think you actually talked to him and asked him about it, and he told you, quote, "I was terribly mad they withheld my meds." Does that sound correct?
Yes.
watched the video and you said he was ambivalent, I think is the word that you used to describe the attempt.
I think I said he appeared ambivalent, yeah.
What does that mean? What do you mean by that?
If someone is definite that this is what they want to do, they will do it. He appeared to be struggling with whether to actually do this or not on the video. I don't think anybody approaches suicide without some degree of ambivalence. But the fact that it went on for so long without a clear attempt, to me, said he's not certain.
Do you think what you looked at was consistent with anger and having his meds withheld and him showing out a little bit?
It could be. I mean, I'm not a mind reader.
Next in your report, you go into a psychiatric history. We're on page 21 now, Doctor.
Okay.
What was the first psychiatric record that you found? That would have been the Navy record, I think, correct?
Yeah, the first record I have is from the Navy.
From, I'm sorry?
The Navy, the U.S. Navy.
That's the one that Mr. Young was talking to you about.
Yes.
And the diagnosis was depressive disorder, not otherwise specified, alcohol dependence, and cannabis or marijuana dependence, correct?
Yes.
He told you, though, when you were talking to him about it, he was depressed because why?
He was not going to be able to be a Navy SEAL. He was in pain with his hip that he had hurt in a previous car accident, and he didn't think he was going to be able to finish basic training due to the physical demands and the pain that he was in.
Did that explanation seem appropriate with the diagnosis?
Yes.
The next time you have any kind of mental health documentation, I believe, is after he was in jail in 2001. Is that correct?
Yes.
From the Illinois Department of Corrections?
Yes.
Let me show you states 205 for identification and ask if you recognize this document as being that evaluation that you reviewed and discussed.
Yes.
Your Honor, the state would offer 205 into evidence at this time.
No objection.
No objection, 205.
So, Doctor, this is a mental health evaluation dated May 28th of 2002 for Tim Jones, correct?
Yes.
What is the diagnosis at that time?
In the Illinois Department of Corrections, he received a diagnosis of polysubstance dependence, which means he was dependent on multiple drugs, and personality disorder not otherwise specified with narcissistic traits.
So what does that mean? What is a personality disorder not otherwise specified with narcissistic traits?
Personality disorder is just a long-term pattern of way people interact with their environment that's maladaptive. In narcissistic persons, they want to be the center of attention. They want to be in control and control others. They require admiration from others. They have fantasies of unlimited wealth, power, things like that.
Then the next documentation you had was the reports of the marriage family therapist, April Hames, from 2012. I'm not sure the exact dates, the 10 months of treatment that he had with her.
Right, during his divorce.
And he was going to see her about basically anxiety about his marriage breaking up and him cheating on him, correct?
Yes.
The next thing you have is a treatment note from Dr. West of the Lexington Family Practice about lorazepam. Can you tell the jury what that is and taking it?
Right. During this period of time, he lost a significant amount of weight, 188 to 166, according to her records. This is going through the divorce and the stress of the divorce. So she prescribed 2 medications for his anxiety. One was citalopram or Celexa. Once again, that's one of those SSRIs, those medicines that we use to treat anxiety and depression. And she also gave him a medicine called Ativan to use PRN or as needed. And that's a medicine similar to Valium or Xanax. It's a tranquilizer.
And then I think he comes back on September 11th
Right.
and reports that he doesn't need to take the medicine anymore and he doesn't have depression or anxiety. That's what he tells them, right?
Right. He said he's better. He doesn't feel this anxious. I mean, I think he's adjusted to the fact that he and Amber are going to be splitting up, getting a divorce. And
That was
he's resigned himself.
2012.
That was September 11th, 2012.
Moving on to his alcohol and drug use history. Can you tell the jury a little about what his alcohol use was?
He started drinking as a teenager, drinking heavily by the time he was 15. He said he was drinking a fifth a day of the Everclear. And around age 17, it got to the point where if he didn't drink, he started to get shaky and have withdrawal symptoms. He said, I was a functional drunk. I was busy with school and a job, so nobody paid attention. After that, he reported drinking 2 shots of whiskey once a week for a number of years, but that once he got married, he gave up all alcohol and drugs. And I'm not sure the marriage was the motivator behind that, but he had religious conversion when he was in prison.
And then he marries Amber after he gets out.
Right.
He says for the 8 years they're together, he doesn't drink and he doesn't do drugs, right?
Correct. Never had a DUI.
He said that he started smoking marijuana at the age of 12.
Right. He would steal it from his father multiple times a day, up to 1/8 of an ounce a day. And he stopped, of course, after he got out of prison and during his marriage, but he started back after Amber separated, after he and Amber separated.
And he reported to you that he had paranoia with marijuana use, right?
Yeah, he said marijuana would make him paranoid. He gave an example that he thought people in the grocery store when he smoked were talking about him.
And then I think he says he stops using marijuana, I think you said 2 weeks before this.
That's what he told me, yes.
But Spice, from what I understand, Spice kind of replaced marijuana.
Spice took over. Spice has similar effects, but is much more potent.
And he told you that he was addicted to marijuana, and then when he started Spice, he became addicted to Spice.
He was addicted to Spice per his own reporting. 5 times a day he would use it. Yep.
You noted that a coworker and a former babysitter, I'm on page 26 now, made comments about what they perceived to be impairments or odd smells during that summer. Is that correct? Second paragraph.
Right. One of his coworkers, Kevin McKinney, one day Mr. Jones called in sick to work. And when Mr. McKinney called Mr. Jones to check on him, he said that he had slurred speech. It was not making sense. A former babysitter said that he smelled like he ate an herb cabinet and always appeared high to her.
You've noted down from talking to him and from reviewing records that you could actually see the Spice purchases escalating in the summer of 2014 from June to August. Is that correct?
Yes, he appeared to be using more and more, which would be consistent with developing what we call tolerance. It takes more and more to get the same effect, just like drinking more and more over time.
And I think your report indicates that in the last 4 weeks leading up to the killing of the children, he spent about $230. Four different purchases, at least as far as we know from records.
As far as we know, yes.
And you also noted from the phone extraction, I'm assuming, that when he was in Orlando taking his kids to Disneyland, he was actually doing internet searches for spice, wasn't he?
He frequently did internet searches, especially when he was going out of town, to want to know, is it legal in this state, and where can you get it? Searching head shops and stuff on the internet.
In fact, the 29th, day after he kills his children, he's looking for drugs on the internet, isn't he?
Yes.
In addition to marijuana and synthetic cannabinoids, Scooby Snacks, he also had some history with cocaine, powder cocaine, correct?
A handful of times around age 19.
And the same with heroin as well, snorting heroin.
Twice at the age of 19.
And then LSD.
A handful of times when he was about 18.
I believe drugs seem to get him in trouble. There's a history of that, isn't there?
His early arrest occurred during periods where he was using drugs. He had marijuana at school. He got in trouble for that.
Moving on to his medical history. Anything in there that you deem to be worthy of talking about in addition to the traumatic brain injury? Because I want to talk about that.
He has this weird thing called, not weird, but glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase deficiency, and that's a fancy medical term, but basically it's a condition where if you take certain medications like sulfur-based drugs, it can cause your red blood cells to break down. So you're not allergic to those drugs, but you just should not take them. And so that was noted that everybody who goes in the military is checked for that. So that was in there. And other than that, everything was pretty much minor, except he did have the head injury.
And you described that, I think from the questioning from Mr. Young, as impressive.
Well, I think it's impressive when you look at it. You could see it. Yeah, you could look at his head and see it.
So what are you concerned about as a psychiatrist as the effects of a traumatic brain injury on his functioning? I know we've all talked about cognition, being smart, not smart, making decisions. So what does your frontal lobe do?
Planning, sequencing, higher levels of thinking that we need to do, thinking abstractly. For example, if I say to somebody who doesn't, to think abstractly is to use words as symbols. Let me give you an example. If I said, people who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. That means if you have something about your character or yourself that you're vulnerable, you don't like being criticized about, you shouldn't criticize others that have the same thing. Someone who's not able to do that would say, you'll break the glass. They're unable to see that that has a symbolic meaning when you say people who live in glass houses should throw stones. Or what goes around comes around. You know, someone who's concrete might say like a wheel. Whereas someone who can think abstractly would say, you do unto others as you would have them do unto you, or if you do wrong, wrong will come back to you. That would be an abstract way of thinking, and that's what your frontal lobe does, helps you do.
Is that executive functioning? Is that what that is?
In part, yes.
Does the frontal lobe also have an influence on behavior?
It can.
So tell the jury about that. What would you be looking for?
I mean, frontal lobe damage can do lots of different things. We have people that become hypersexual. You know, they were pretty normal, and all of a sudden they get a frontal head injury, and their judgment goes out the window because that's where judgment is, and they'll start being promiscuous was never the case for them before they had the head injury. You could have people that have trouble with aggression and managing irritability. Our frontal lobe serves in part as our stopping mechanism when we're angry so that we don't go over a certain point. So a variety of different things can happen as behavioral manifestations of a frontal head injury. The best way to categorize that and diagnose that is by history. How is was this person different after the head injury than they were before?
And I think I heard you testify that you would expect those changes to manifest themselves within a year.
Oh, certainly, or to be noticed.
So in your review of all the documents that were provided to you by the state and the defense, did you see anything that would support frontal lobe damage and the consequences of it?
Well, I did, actually. The one thing that I saw, which was I was provided a report from a neuropsychologist who said he had an IQ of 87. I think I've testified to this before. And I'm like, there's just no way this guy got through Mississippi State University with a summa cum laude computer engineering degree with an IQ of 87. So I had my own neuropsychologist come in and perform testing to look at his ability, and guess what? He did much, much better. He was in the highest percentiles in most of all the tests, or at least above 85%, which is what you would expect. So I had to figure out why was he so low when the neuropsychologist for the defense tested him. And one of the things is he was on 320 milligrams of Geodon, which is a very sedating medicine. And having your brain slowed by that medicine can make your results less than what you can actually do. And in fact, he told our neuropsychologist that he didn't do well with the defense neuropsychologist because he was snowed by the Geodon he was on.
Tim Jones told Dr. Cruz that he was slowed by the Geodon?
Yes.
Other than the 89 or 87 IQ that was reported out, do you see any other evidence of any kind of impairment or deficit or history of behavioral problems related to a TBI?
I do not.
Do you see any executive functioning problems, a history of anything reported, documentation of related to the traumatic brain injury?
No, there's no way he would be able to do his job at Intel if he had significant executive functioning problems.
Anything about controlling his emotions?
No, he has a history of being a strict disciplinarian with his kids. But I cannot relate that to his head injury. I also, he had evidence of gullibility. Get rich quick schemes on the computer or the TV, he would sort of gravitate towards. But according to his grandmother, when I spoke to her, he was like that from a very early age, long before the head injury. So I couldn't attribute that to the head injury either.
Let's move on to, I think we've discussed in big terms, you discussed his success at school at Mississippi State. We talked about the military. We talked about the Illinois Department of Correction. Let's talk about what happens after he graduates Mississippi State. So starting over on 31 now, adult function, employment, and education history. Obviously, he did well in school.
He did very well in school. Graduated with a 3.81 GPA for Mississippi State as a President's Scholar, and was a member of Honor Society's Phi Kappa Phi, Tau Beta Phi, and Eta Kappa Nu. He even made those good grades while working some part-time to help support his family.
And he was married and had kids too, right?
He was married and had kids, so he was balancing a whole bunch of things well. And then after he graduated, he got the job at Intel here, performing validation engineering. He told me that meant those processes in your computer, his job was to try to make them break, try to break them. He made approximately $70,000 a year. They moved to Leesville from Starkville, Mississippi.
Let me ask you a question right there. Did he explain why he wanted to live out in the country? Was there a reason?
Yes, because he was tired of living in an apartment in Starkville. He wanted space. He also has an interest in homesteading,
Which was homesteading?
or living off the land, so to speak. He had animals, chickens. I think he had I can't remember everything. He had a goat, dogs, cats, chickens, turkeys, rabbits, and 3 goats. So having plenty of space, lots of land,
Go ahead, I didn't mean to
is
interrupt.
what he was interested in.
What he was interested in, which is my question, I guess. Just because he was interested in homesteading and wanted to live in the country doesn't mean he's crazy, does it?
I hope not.
During the summer of 2014, he applied to and was accepted to medical school in the Caribbean, correct?
Yes.
And that was something that had been a dream of his for a long time, isn't that true?
He's had lots of interest, languages. I mean, he's very bright, and bright people tend to have a variety of interests, but he would study Hebrew, he would study, I think at one time, Russian, maybe, just lots of languages, money, day trading, homesteading. He became interested at one point in Freemasonry, but he wanted to live in the country. And then he thought about going to medical school because I think he said he felt somewhat bored with his job at Intel after a while.
He was bored with it.
Bored a little bit. It's doing the same thing over and over, and he wanted to help people. And he wanted to see if he could design skin that would grow on metal. He wanted to be some sort of plastic surgeon, is what he told me.
You had mentioned his discipline style. Did he tell you where the basis for that style came from?
Yes.
What did he tell you?
Shortly after he and Amber married, they moved to Pennsylvania. There they met a Mennonite family. And I'm sorry, you asking about the discipline?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
You're talking about the Mennonite family.
Right. He met a Mennonite family, and he was just so impressed with how well behaved their children were. They had 8 or 10 children, and he said they were extremely well behaved. And he said the Mennonites corrected their children with words and spankings. He always wanted his children to be well behaved. He told me that he reserved corporal punishment or spanking for 2 particular offenses. That would be lying and fighting. But he became interested in having well-behaved children and wanted to model his upbringing of his children like this Mennonite family.
He believed in corporal punishment for, he told you, lying and fighting. Those are the 2 instances when he would use corporal punishment.
Yes. Lying or not telling the truth and fighting.
You also, in addition to reviewing records and reviewing police reports and mental health and whatever else was provided to you, you actually called some people and talked to ones that you wanted to follow up with, correct?
Yes.
One of those was the defendant's father, Mr. Timothy Jones Sr., correct?
Yes.
He told you that his son was well behaved and did well in school.
Yes.
He said he didn't know anything about his son having any self-harm behaviors.
That's correct. We had seen that in the military record, so I wanted to ask him about that.
Well, I was going to say, why did you ask his father that question?
Because it was in the military records.
So in the military records, he said that he did do
Right.
behavior.
Or it says he has a history of cutting on himself with a paper clip and maybe, I can't remember specifically, a knife or paper clip. And he denied that to me because I've never said that and I've never done that. And so I wanted to ask the father because you don't just trust what a defendant tells you. And the father said he had no knowledge of that.
He told you that he did not see a personality change in his son or any change in his son after the traumatic brain injury.
Correct.
And he said that he had no knowledge of his son having any kind of auditory hallucinations. Is that correct?
That's correct.
He said that he talked to his son a few days before Labor Day. There were plans for them to come. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then Friday, after the children were killed that day, he called his dad and said that something had come up and canceled. Do you know what he told his dad?
I believe he told him something came up at work.
Right.
So I won't be coming to Mississippi.
The next thing that you talk to him about is the next time he sees the defendant, which is in Mississippi after the car stop, when he and the Mississippi authorities are trying to find out where the children are, correct?
Right.
And how does he describe his son?
You want me to use his words?
I can use it if you want me to do it.
He said he was batshit crazy, all over the place, talking crazy. I have never seen him like that. I almost didn't recognize him. That was the day after his arrest, about 2 to 3 p.m. He was arrested the night before, I think about 9 p.m. or something. So his mental status, and that's the same time that the officer said he was sweating profusely. And someone,
He told you that he was using spice as he was driving around.
yes.
I mean, States 58 is a cop.
And these symptoms would be consistent with withdrawal from spice.
So you get a high on the spice, but when you're addicted to it, your body wants it. So when you say withdrawal, what do you mean?
What he displayed appeared consistent with withdrawal from synthetic cannabis, from spice. Sweating, it's delirious and behaves bizarrely. But then by the next 24 hours, that's better.
Right, so there's a difference. How does he describe him the next day on the 28th? How does he describe
By
him?
the next day, the defendant looked, quote, a lot more like the Timmy I knew. He was more calmed and more normal and calmed down.
And to you, those two descriptions a day apart are very important, aren't they?
They are very important because they indicate to me if this were psychosis due to schizophrenia, it shouldn't get better by itself without treatment.
If it was schizophrenia and he was crazy, foaming at the mouth, however you want to describe it, short of him getting on antipsychotic medication,
He should not have gotten better.
he shouldn't have gotten better. So it's your opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as an expert in the field of forensic psychiatry that it's related to drugs,
Yes,
specifically synthetic cannabinoids.
yes, the one that's in his system when they tested his blood. So his blood had the same chemical in it, AB-PINACA, I guess we say pinica, that his blood tested positive for that, and my understanding is the evidence from the car, the Scooby Snacks bag, tested positive for the exact same chemical.
That's correct.
And I wasn't aware of this chemical because it's not exactly in my area of expertise, but I called the toxicologist, the doctor, the MD, pathologist who ran the lab that tested it. And she even said, we don't even test for that anymore because spice is a moving target. Once they ban one substance, they put another one in it that makes you high. They change the chemical just a little bit. So AB pinica was something they were putting in spice back in 2014. But they don't even test for that anymore because it's been banned.
Just changes to something else.
They're using something else to get the same high.
So if you use marijuana, or in this case, synthetic cannabinoids, does it put you at increased risk for psychotic symptoms?
Yes.
What is this, when we say psychotic symptoms, what do we mean?
Hallucinating, Acting bizarrely, disorganized thinking, even delusions at times.
Doesn't have to, but it could.
Yeah, and it can do it to a normal person, or a person without any family history.
But it doesn't have to happen.
It doesn't have to happen, no.
Smoking synthetic cannabinoids can cause psychotic events later, not just at that moment, correct?
Well, it can last. Typically, a substance-induced psychosis, you can have symptoms that continue up to a month after your last known use.
In addition to talking to the defendant's father, you also talked to Miss Roberta Thornsberry, his grandmother, correct?
Yes.
She again answered your question. She didn't have any knowledge about self-harm.
No.
She said he was a good kid, didn't get in trouble much. She talks about visiting him in Atlanta, Georgia,
Yes.
and you and her worked together and figured out the dates, right?
Well, she was. I don't know if she believed me or not, but I said I don't think this was the weekend before. I think it was the first weekend in August.
And you figured that out from
Phone records and the texts I sent back and forth, and the banking records for paying for the room at the Embassy Suites.
She described him as sweating a lot.
Yes.
One of the things she did. That's important because that's also consistent with synthetic cannabinoid use, isn't it?
Yes, it can be, but it's also August in the South. And so it's May in the South right now, and I'm hot. So,
Christina Elke, that's the babysitter.
one of them.
Yes. The last babysitter for Gabriel and Abigail, that last month and a half of their lives.
Right.
Was at that house or trailer near where the children lived, the defendant.
Correct. Next door.
How did she describe him socially to you?
She said he was weird, somewhat geeky, typical computer guy, sort of nerdy. She did not think he was mentally ill, and she was not aware that he was using drugs.
Toshiro Inabinet. Who is Toshiro Inabinet?
He was Mr. Jones's first assigned counselor when he got to the South Carolina Department of Corrections for safekeeping.
So do you know how long, what kind of contact did Mr. Inabinet have with Mr. Jones?
He had almost daily contact until Mr. Jones was transferred to a different facility.
Do you know approximately how long that would have been?
If I can look at my timeline, I can tell you. I think it was sometime. He went into the Department of Corrections on September 12th, I believe. He was transferred there as a safekeeper. A safekeeper is somebody that the jail doesn't feel comfortable housing them because he thinks they will be a target from other inmates, and there's concern about the defendant's safety. So the governor of South Carolina has to sign an order ordering the Department of Corrections to keep this person in there and a safekeeper. So they're pretty much locked down a lot. So he was there, and that was at the time, I believe, at Kirkland Correctional Institution, and he stayed there. I can't recall. I mean, it's like a year later or more when he was, I believe, transferred to
So,
Lee.
do you feel comfortable saying that Mr. Inabinet had almost daily contact with Mr. Jones for a year
Yes.
or more? It's true that Mr. Inabinet told you when you spoke with him that Mr. Jones complained of hearing voices, correct?
Yes.
And he also told you that Mr. Inhabitant never observed the defendant to be responding to internal stimuli as if truly hallucinating, correct?
Correct.
What does that mean?
Many times when people are having psychotic hallucinations, auditory voices, they will be distracted. You'll ask them something and they'll appear like they're listening to something else that you can't see, and it becomes sort of obvious. Or sometimes you can see them like whispering under their breath to whoever's talking to them, to whatever auditory hallucination they're experiencing. They talk back to them, and he never noticed that behavior.
So that would be what Mr. Inhabitant told you about no corresponding behavior would actually be consistent with your conversation with Mr. Jones and having the voices change to not being voices in your thoughts.
Right, anxious thoughts. I think that's what he was referring to when he says he's hearing voices.
You also spoke with Beverly Woods and Jim Page, who also were at the South Carolina Department of Corrections.
This might be a one typo. I think it's Beverly Wood.
Wood.
I put an S there, but I think her last name is actually Wood.
Miss Wood, Dr. Wood. She is a clinical psychiatrist for the Department of Corrections.
Yes, she's the lead psychiatrist for the Department of Corrections.
What did she tell you about her treatment course and her diagnoses with Mr. Jones?
Well, she stated that she based on her diagnosis of what he was telling her. And what I specifically wanted to know was she aware of the extent of his use of spice prior to him getting to the Department of Corrections or being arrested? And she was not. He had said he used cannabis and alcohol and spice, but she was not aware, had not been provided information as to exactly how much of that he had done.
Do you know the history of her diagnosis changing for Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Would you tell the jury what it was and give them the timeline for that?
Well, it's some.
Dr. Wood testifies to what her diagnosis was and the reasons that she gave it.
What I'll say is I reviewed the records.
Fair enough.
Your Honor, I've got this witness up there. I'm on cross, so I can go into whatever I want. If he wants to call his witnesses, he can do that too.
How do I work?
I'm asking for him for purpose for his reasons.
Well, I want to hear about his diagnosis. You can ask a question. Go ahead.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Objection's noted.
Her initial diagnosis was something we call psychosis not otherwise specified. And what that is, it's a basket term, meaning he's talking about voices or hallucinations, auditory hallucinations. I don't know if it's schizophrenia. I don't know if it's drug-induced. You know, it's just saying he's reporting these symptoms, but I don't know exactly what the exact diagnosis is. So for right now, I'm just going to call this psychosis not otherwise specified. Then at some point, it was changed to schizoaffective disorder.
What is schizoaffective?
Schizoaffective disorder means that you have met the diagnostic criteria for schizophrenia. But in addition to that, you have had symptoms of either a depressed mood or manic episodes that have not been brief. You've had ongoing mood symptoms as well.
In the documents that you received from SCDC, did you see support for that diagnosis?
No.
What was lacking?
It's not documented that he met the criteria that would be in the DSM-5 to get a diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder. All it just says is complaints of mood swings, and then the diagnosis change. And
Your conversation with her, she told you that when he said,
Don't put the witness. Go ahead with the different diagnosis.
you called her for information,
yes, I met with her.
you met with her. What, if anything, did she tell you about whether he displayed disorganized thinking or behavior?
He never displayed disorganized thinking
And why is that important?
because that's a common symptom of schizophrenia and one of the main symptoms that you look for, in addition to hallucinations and delusions.
And then I think you said that she was not aware of the extent of the synthetic cannabinoid use, correct?
Correct.
Based on your conversations with her, what did she tell you about her diagnosis in retrospect?
She said she believed that he may have had more of a
Overrule the objection. He can answer that.
she thought in retrospect, looking back, that perhaps he had more of a mood disorder than a psychotic disorder like schizophrenia.
And a mood disorder is what?
Major depression, bipolar disorder.
Moving on in your report, mental status exam. What is a mental status exam?
The mental status exam is a series of questions we ask everybody that just looks at their overall cognitive functioning. We ask, do you know what today is? Do you know the day of the week? Are they oriented? We ask them to remember 3 things and want to see if they can repeat them after 5 minutes. Is their memory intact? We test their concentration. We ask them to spell the word world backwards. DLROW, that's requires concentration. We ask them to interpret a proverb like the ones I gave you before. What goes around comes around. Glass houses, to see if they can think abstractly. That's looking at frontal lobe function. We ask them about mood. We ask them a fund of knowledge. Could you name the president? Who was past presidents before him? How far can you go back? So.
Anything unusual about the mental?
No, his mental status examination has always been normal. He comes across as very bright by his vocabulary.
Now, you also, and we touched on it briefly earlier, you wanted some neuropsychological testing, correct?
Right. I wanted to see if this head injury if we could measure any functional problems with his brain as a result of having the head injury.
What were the results as far as his cognitive abilities?
Overall, his cognitive abilities were intact. There was no clinically significant findings.
How, in addition to cognitive testing, was there also other testing?
Yes, there was some personality testing, and there was also some testing, what we call validity testing.
So what is validity testing?
Validity testing is testing designed to measure his effort and whether he could be exaggerating or feigning symptoms.
What, if anything, was reported to you from those tests as far as exaggeration of psychotic symptoms?
There was evidence on those tests that would suggest he was feigning or exaggerating symptoms. However, I did not diagnose him with malingering because I felt in judging that rather than maybe exaggerating symptoms to be found insane, he was exaggerating symptoms to convince himself that he's mentally ill so that he can live with what he did.
You gave him the benefit of the doubt again.
Yes. I mean, I've seen people malinger, and I've diagnosed malingering lots, but his wasn't. I was actually surprised by those tests a little bit, but they are what they are.
We've used the word malingering. Tell the jury what malingering means.
Faking. And if I say they're faking symptoms for secondary gain, and what I mean by that, to get disability, or to get out of military service, or in this type of situation, to be found insane. and not held responsible for what you did. Those are secondary gains, things outside of him that he's trying to get by exaggerating symptoms. And I didn't get the sense that that's what he was doing. I got the sense that he was always worried he'd get schizophrenia. His mother had schizophrenia. He just assumed these anxious thoughts that he was having was evidence of schizophrenia because he didn't like it. And he was trying to convince himself so he could live with what he did.
Moving on to diagnostic formulation in your report. What is diagnostic formulation?
That means I take all the information I've gathered about his symptoms and I look at DSM-5 and say, does he meet the diagnostic criteria for any of these disorders?
All right, at the top of page 42, you explain why schizoaffective disorder was not, in your opinion, an appropriate diagnosis, correct?
Right.
Why is that?
Schizoaffective disorder is similar to schizophrenia, and you have to, in order to be diagnosed with either, you have to have two or more of the following for a significant portion of time during a 1 month period. So not just fleeting, these have to be present for a significant amount of time for an entire month period at least. And these include, one, delusions. I think he had paranoid thought about Natan. I did not think he was an overtly delusional thought because it came out of nowhere.
So let's stop for a second. What's the difference between being paranoid and being delusional?
You can have paranoid thoughts that don't reach what we call delusional intensity. In other words, if I had said, well, wait a minute, could it be that Natan was not trying to harm you? And if it's not delusional, he would say, well, maybe not. But delusions just don't start suddenly. They develop over time.
So what you're referring to as a paranoia here is
A paranoid thought that he may have motivated some of what he was doing.
Natan's out to get me.
Yes.
You're giving him credit for it being true because the only place we know it's coming from is him. Right?
That's right. I gave him the benefit of the doubt for that.
But there's no history. It's a one-time event, and that's what he told you.
Well, there had been some earlier thinking that Natan and Mira wanted to be back with Amber, with their mom. But as far as he's very specific, when I woke up that day, everything was normal. I went to work. I had no paranoid thoughts about Natan or anybody else in the family. He smoked spice all day, or while he's at work, he comes home, he brings food, the outlet doesn't work. Oh, someone's done something to the outlet, he thinks is Natan. And he is exercising Natan until he confesses, and he won't confess. And then Natan, he said, stomped on his glasses. These expensive glasses he had very long, which I think probably made him madder. But he was not, until that outlet was blown, he had no paranoid thoughts about Natan. And it was during the course of the discipline that he said, why isn't he telling me he did it?
And the reason we're discussing paranoia versus delusion is because I have schizophrenia, and one of the things that you need to have, or one of the things you need to look for is delusion.
You have to have two of these things.
Right. Delusion being one of them.
Right.
Paranoia is not on that list.
No.
In addition, did you find that he had any delusions? Did he have any fixed, false, long-term beliefs
In my opinion, no.
about anything?
No.
And you also noted that other than the night of the day after his arrest, there has not been any disorganized speech or behavior.
Right. He was certainly disorganized the 24 hours after his arrest.
When his father was in the room and he's foaming at the mouth.
All right. That is a good description of disorganized behavior.
But other than that episode, you don't see that anywhere.
No.
And that's also one of the potential elements for schizophrenia.
Correct.
So of the 5 criterion listed in the DSM-5 for schizophrenia, do you see whether he had any?
Okay. He may have had 2 2 periods of hallucinations that were very brief, one at age 10, if I believe what he's telling me, and maybe one that night. But once again, they have to be present for a significant portion of time during a 1-month period. And a fleeting hallucination is not a significant portion of time during a 1-month period. So he doesn't meet this criteria, but more importantly, there's another criteria for schizophrenia that says the symptoms are not better accounted for by the use of illicit substances. And so it's very hard to make a diagnosis of schizophrenia when someone's psychotic if they've been using substances and they've never been psychotic before. It makes medical sense to attribute it to the use of the drug or withdrawal from the drug.
When there's not a history of psychosis and you're not meeting the criterion, even if you met the criterion, you're supposed to go look for
Drugs, before you need to rule that out before you...
So you rule drugs out before you even start talking about anything else, correct?
Right. Now, for example, let me give you, if someone had schizophrenia, that they developed psychotic symptoms, there was no drug use, okay? And they were hospitalized and they were treated, and all's well and good, they go back home. And then they get psychotic again, and this time there's drugs in their system. I would still say they have schizophrenia. They just happen to be using drugs. But in his case, there's no prior history of psychotic symptoms. And the first time he presents 24 hours after his arrest with very disorganized behavior, we know there's synthetic cannabinoids in his blood, in his system, in his brain, and he's been using heavily and increasing his use in the months before this happened. That's why I attribute that behavior to the drugs.
Other than the audible voice that you give him credit for saying on the night that he killed his 4 children after Detention, did you see any other symptoms of psychosis?
No,
He didn't even tell you any other symptoms of psychosis, did he?
no.
He actually denied them when you asked him.
Yes, I mean, there's been a lot that he's a loner and doesn't have a lot of social, which can be seen in schizophrenia, but he desires relationships. He wants to have relationships. He downloaded books about how to meet women off the internet.
He has not exhibited disorganized speech and behavior. He didn't have anything you call a delusion. You don't see any functioning impairment with his traumatic brain injury or for any reason other than this event, correct?
Well, he's losing weight over the summer. I mean, I think that's spy shoes.
Yes, sir. I was actually, and I guess my question, I didn't ask it right. He did not exhibit any impairment in functioning.
No, he was working. He was doing okay at work. He was able to hold his job. There's papers where he was planning meals, what to eat Monday for the family. There were a lot of notebooks with that information. He was meeting his bills. Now, he had a tendency to overdraw his account many times, but he knew the money was coming in, and it was just like right before his deposit happened. But he was paying bills, paying for the after-school program for Mira Natan and Elias.
He had described to SCDC, and then I think you followed up talking with him about visual permutations.
Yes.
Tell the jury what that is.
He said that he saw things on the wall. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
How many times did he tell you he saw? How many times did he say that he had these visual permutations?
Several times to me, and these are very atypical for mental illness. You don't typically see this type of thing, and they're very common in malingering to have these fantastical type hallucinations. But if you've ever been locked in a cell for 23 hours a day with nothing to do and no distractions, that type of environment can cause people to start imagining that they're seeing things. And once again, I gave him the benefit of the doubt and not diagnosis of malingering, but
diagnosis for Mr. Jones to a reasonable degree of certainty as an expert in the field of forensic psychiatry is what?
Substance-induced psychosis, which is the paranoia I was talking about, that was related to his use of spice. That's one diagnosis. That resolved.
And you're giving him credit when he tells you that he heard a voice. You give him credit for that.
Yeah, hearing one voice is not a diagnosis make.
And you're also giving him credit for, I guess, the paranoia about that one time being afraid of Natan.
Right, and also, you know, thinking that maybe he and Mira might have something to do with the DSS allegations, or they conspiring to get back with Amber. I don't think a 6 and 8 year old are, I mean, I could be wrong, but are that sophisticated to do something like that.
As a forensic psychiatrist, you are aware that voluntary use of drugs is not a defense, correct?
Correct.
Let's move on to what he says happened that night. On page 44. You've talked to him, I think, 4 different times, so that it varies a little bit. I don't know whether you want to take a break or you want me to keep going.
Let's take a short break. I'm getting a signal from the jury. Want to talk about the case? Have you back in your few?